In this nugget, you and I get to deploy linked clones using an automatic pool. This will save us disk space and deployment time. Let's begin. One of the prerequisites for using linked clones is to make sure we have Composer up and running and configured. And with Composer in place, in order to use linked clones, all we're going to do is, in vSphere, we're going to take a snapshot of our favorite virtual machine, our golden image. And that golden image, let's imagine it's this one right here. It would be a virtual machine that has the Horizon View agent installed on it. It's been optimized. And we're simply going to use vSphere Web Client to go ahead and take a snapshot of that virtual machine. And then we're going to go to View Administrator, and inside of View Administrator, we'll create an automatic pool. And during the wizard for creating an automated pool, we'll simply indicate that we want to use linked clones. And there's a few options that we have to answer regarding linked clones. And so we'll answer those questions as part of the wizard. And when we're done, the pool will provision for us linked clones. So our first stop is here in the vSphere Web Client. And I've got this beautiful virtual machine. It's called Parent-VM3. That's just what I happen to name it. It's also been optimized, or it could be optimized, so that it is like the perfect machine that we want to replicate over and over again. So here in the vSphere Web Client, we're going to right-click on that virtual machine, and we are going to take a snapshot of it by clicking on Take Snapshot. Let's go ahead and name this Snapshot 1. So we'll add a description, and then we'll click on OK. And now the vSphere Web Client has created that snapshot for us. Our next step is to go over to View Administrator. So here in View Administrator, under Catalog and Desktop Pools, we have our Engineering Pool, we have our HR Automatic Pool, and our Sales Pool. So what you and I get to do is create an additional pool. So we're going to click on Add to create a new pool. And it is going to be an automated desktop pool. So we'll click on Next. Do we want these to be dedicated to individual users, and do we want automatic assignment to happen? We'll click on Next. And this, my friend, is the key difference between having an automated pool and an automated pool that's deploying linked clones. We're going to choose this radio button that says I want to use View Composer Linked Clones. Because we only have a single vCenter in Composer, it shows us those right here. They are currently highlighted and selected. So we'll click on Next to continue, and then we'll give this pool a name. And let's name it Linked Clone Pool. And then we can put a description on there as well if we wanted to. We'll click on Next. It's enabled. Let's go ahead and specify that we want to log off users after 5 minutes of disconnecting from a VM. We want to give them the ability to go ahead and reset or reboot their computers, and their refresh OS disk after a log off, that's new. That's because we're dealing with a linked clone pool. And the refresh here, if we said yes to it, would mean that after that user logs off, their Delta disk effectively would be wiped. And the next time they logged on, it would be like logging onto the system for the first time. However, if we say never, it won't remove the Delta disk, and when they go back to that VM, any customizations or changes that they had made to that desktop will still be there when they log in. And let's go down also, and let's enable HTML as well for this pool. Because having the HTML as an option is pretty handy. Because if our users find themselves at a computer or machine that has no Horizon View client installed, they can still use HTML if the browser on that computer supports HTML5. So with those settings in place, let's go ahead and click on Next. Next we have our provisioning settings. So if we want to use a pattern here, for example, linked VM dash, and then we can use the open curly bracket, n:\fixed equals, and let's go ahead and use 2. And that'll be okay for naming up to 99 VMs, which will be more than enough for our lab. And we'll put a closed curly bracket. And then we'll scroll down a little bit more. For desktop pool sizing, the maximum number of machines, let's go ahead and say 50. The number of spare powered on machines, we'll leave that at 1. And then we have this new option. For example, let's say there's some update that needs to happen to all of our virtual machines. Well, if it's doing maintenance on all your VMs, wouldn't that maybe imply that maybe no VMs are going to be up and ready for users to connect? So what we could do is say, you know what, I want to make sure that we have at least, 2 VMs, even during maintenance times, that are up and running and ready for a user to connect to it. And the default value for that is 0. And then for the provisioning timing, we want to specify that we're going to provision machines on demand, and let's say a minimum number of machines is going to be 1. And that way in our lab environment, it doesn't go out and try to provision all these machines right now. And then we'll click on Next. Next we have our options regarding a persistent disk and a non-persistent disk. So we can specify the size, we can use our drive letters for each of these. So for the persistent disk, I'm going to go ahead and make that a little bit smaller. I'm going to make it 1024 megabytes, which is 1 gig. And we'll have that be drive letter D. And then for the disposable non-persistent disk, it's going to use 4 gigs, and it's going to automatically assign a drive letter. And on the persistent disk, by default, it's going to redirect the user's Windows profile to that persistent disk. Because the user's profile is on the persistent disk separate from the Delta disk, as well as any data that the user might want to store on that persistent disk, it won't be wiped away every time there's a refresh or a recompose. So we'll go ahead and click on Next. Next, it's asking us whether or not we want to use vSAN for our storage. Now, in my lab, I don't have any vSAN. However, if we did have vSAN, it's right here that we could specify that we want to use vSAN for our storage. We also have options here about separating the data stores for the persistent and Delta disk. When it says OS disks, it's referring to the VM's Delta disk. And this bottom check mark gives us the option of separating data stores between the VM's Delta disk, the OS disk, and the replica. And the replica is that base image, that base disk that was created by Composer and is shared across the linked clones. In my case, I've got one large shared data store that I want to use for everything, so I'm not going to separate them, and I'm going to click on Next. So now it's asking, great, who is your parent VM? So if we click on Browse, you'll notice here it's showing me only 2 VMs. And the question might be asked, well, how does it know which parent VMs we want to use? Why is it only showing us 2? And the reason it's showing us only 2 is because it's ruling out other VMs that don't qualify as a parent VM. For example, if there's another VM that does not have a snapshot, that's not going to be a good candidate as a parent VM. If we want to see all possible VMs, we can click this checkbox, and then it shows us all of them. But again, the only 2 in this case that have a snapshot are Parent VM and Parent VM3, which was my 3rd attempt at customizing and getting that golden image just right. So I'm going to select Parent VM3 as my golden image and click on OK. Step number 2, it's asking us for the snapshot regarding that golden image. So we'll click on Browse. It's going to show us all of the snapshots. There's the one that we took. In the description, it says snapshot 1 of parent, and that's indeed the one we want. So we'll highlight that and click on OK. Next, it's asking us where we want to put these virtual machines. So we'll click on Browse. And what I'm going to do, I don't have a folder prepared for them. I'm going to select Vegas. It will automatically create a folder for us inside of vSphere. Or if we had folders already created and we wanted to select one, we'd select it right here. I'll click on OK. And in step 4, it's asking us about the compute resource that we're going to use to run these VMs. So we'll click on Browse, and we'll select our cluster that is cleverly named Cluster, and click on OK. And then step 5 is what resource pool do we want to put these in? Now I do have a resource pool already created in vSphere. It's called View Desktops, and we could have multiple resource pools created. So we'll select the one that we have here and click on OK. And the final question, number 6, is which data store do you want to use? You already told it that you don't want to use vSAN. So we'll browse. We'll select our single iSCSI data store. And here it's showing us this data store has 426 gigabytes free. That's here as well. And then it has these 3 values regarding recommendations. So for example, if we were doing refreshes for every single VM after every single logoff for these linked clones, the Delta disks would get very, very small, and we could be very, very aggressive regarding the oversubscription of our available data stores. Or if we knew that these machines were very rarely going to be refreshed, and that the Delta disks could grow and grow and grow and get huge, we might want to have a lot more storage available and ready to support that. So if we said aggressive, that means we could get more VMs using the same data store, but then we'd have less room for growth in the event that the Delta disks, the OS disk for each of the VMs, needed to grow. So starting off, you may want to say conservative, and then actually measure and see how much disk space is being taken up over time with linked clones, and then plan appropriately. So we'll go ahead and click on OK, and then we'll click on Next. We can use the storage accelerator. We can tell it to reclaim VM disk space. We'll click on Next. And now we get to tell the system about how to handle these linked clones as they're created and put into the domain. What container do we want them to go into? What domain do we want them to go into? The default radio button for Use Quick Prep is enabled. However, if you and I want a unique SID created for each virtual machine as it's put into the domain, it's likely we may want to use sysprep. So this radio button for sysprep, if we select that and scroll down, then we choose our customization file that we're going to use in combination with creating the new link clones. And because I already know that my customization specification called DOM1 works, I've tested it manually, I'm going to choose that one right here as well. And then we'll click on Next. So here's the summary. So we could review our choices and then make sure everything is the way we want. Also, up here at the top right, we have this checkbox for entitle users after this wizard finishes. And that's a great thing to do, because if this pool isn't entitled, no users will be able to use the resources associated with this pool. So with that checked and with these settings in place, we'll click on Finish. And now it's brought up the option for entitlement for this pool. We'll click on Add. Let's go ahead and use domain users as our group. So we'll sort based on that. And we have one that comes up, domain users. We'll click on OK. And then Close. And now that pool, called linked clone pool, is not only created, it's also entitled for members of domain users. Now, the other really interesting thing that we had to do is let's go over to vSphere Web Client for a moment. So here in the vSphere Web Client, check this out. Over here on the right, we have a clone virtual machine operation happening. It's creating, I should say Composer is creating the replica for us that we can use as the base image for our first linked clone. It's also created this folder called Linked Clone Pool. It also created a folder called VMware View Composer Replica folder, and that's where it's going to store the replicas, the base images that are being used as part of the linked clones. If we go back to View Administrator, and here in View Administrator, if we go into the inventory pane under Resources down to Machines, you'll notice that right here we have this linked VM1 that is currently in the process of being provisioned. And so remember, the very first virtual machine that's going to be provisioned is going to take at least as long and maybe a little longer than a full clone. And that's because the replica has to be created from the snapshot, then the virtual machine is created and linked to that base image, as well as being customized. And the beauty is the second and third and fourth VMs that we bring up as linked clones, because the base image is already in place, the replica is already set, those subsequent VMs are going to be a lot faster, because even though those subsequent VMs are going to go through the customization steps, the actual replication of a full new hard drive for them, like 10 or 15 gigs, that doesn't have to happen, because they'll be linked back to the base image, which is being provided by the replica. So what you and I are going to do is we are going to give this a full 30 minutes to sit and cook and create the replica in the first VM, and then we'll come back in 30 minutes and we'll take a look at the results. Now to the magic of editing, it's about 40 minutes later. And now back here in Horizon View Administrator, if we click on Refresh, it shows us that this linked VM01 is now available. And if we sort based on the desktop pools, we can see that this is the only VM currently in that pool, and that is a linked clone. If we go to persistent disks, you'll notice that we have a single persistent disk that's associated with that linked VM number 1. And just as a double check, if we go over to the vSphere Web Client and we open up the folder called Linked Clone Pool, there's our linked VM number 1. And in the VMware View Composer Replica folder, we have the replica that is being used as the base image. So our next exciting step is for you and I to go to Lois's desktop and connect to the connection server and then access a resource in that linked clone pool. At this point, it would just be linked VM01 as our only option. So here on Lois's desktop, we'll log in as Lois. And we have the beautiful lavender background to remind us that this is the computer that Lois is physically sitting at. And so from here, we'll launch the Horizon View client. If we want to go ahead and use the credentials that Lois is currently logged in with instead of having to provide them every time, we can select the option of Login as Current User, put a check mark right there, so that we don't have to re-authenticate every time we go to the connection server. So with that set, and we're logged in Lois locally on this computer, we'll go up to the connection server by double-clicking on the connection server icon. And lo and behold, here are the 4 pools that Lois is entitled to use due to her being a member of the domain users group. We've got the engineering pool and the sales pool. Those are both manual pools. We have the HR auto pool, which is creating for us on demand full clones. And then we have the linked clone pool, which is creating for us on demand when needed linked clones, with those linked clones referring back to that base image of the replica. So let's go ahead and double click on linked clone pool. And now, Lois is connected to a remote desktop, so we can resize that a little bit if we want to, and we could customize that if we wanted to. Let's right click, go to personalize, let's change the background to a solid color, and let's go ahead and pick something orangey. How about that one? Then we could also, on this desktop, we could right click and let's create a new folder. And we'll name that folder from linked clone pool. So when we see it, we'll know exactly what we're talking about. Now, because we are using persistent disks, and for the pool, it's putting our entire profile on that persistent disk, even if we did a refresh or a recompose on this virtual machine, because the user's profile, including their desktop, is stored on that persistent disk, that wouldn't be bothered or wiped away. So if we go to Explore by clicking on the folder and look at the drives available, here we have our persistent disk, which is D, and we have our disposable disk, which is H. So if we go to the D drive by double-clicking on it and go to Users and go to Lois, you'll notice it has all these really cool things, and the reason they're all here is that those are all kept as part of Lois's profile. The other thing I'd like to show you too is that because we are using this virtual machine, and we said we always want to have one up and ready in this pool, in the background, Composer, working in conjunction with vCenter, has created an additional virtual machine, or is in the process of doing that, so we'll have that hot spare ready to go. And here in vSphere, in the web client, we can see that there's a linked VM number 2 now up and running, and over in the recent tasks over here on the right, we can see the process it was going through to create and deploy that. And again, for that second virtual machine, it went a heck of a lot faster because it didn't have to provision an entire dedicated hard drive for that second linked clone. And to bring this full circle, let's go back to the Horizon View Administrator under the Inventory, Resources, and Machines. And here, if we look at linked VM number 1 now, it's got Lois's name associated with it. That's the automatic assignment. And or on the right, regarding status, it shows connected. Also, we have linked VM number 2, which shows as available. And that happened again pretty darn quick in comparison to a full clone because it didn't have to provision the entire hard drive. In this nugget, we've demonstrated how we can save disk space and deployment time by using automatic pools and linked clones. I have had a lot of fun in this nugget. I'm so glad that you joined me for it. I hope that this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.